Here is the translated and expanded text, adhering to the given constraints. I turned and headed towards the old gramophone in the corner of the room, my little treasure that I rarely used. Selecting a record, I chose a slow melody, something from the old tangos I had loved in my youth. The music filled the room, soft and enveloping, and I turned back to him, feeling my body awaken to its rhythm. "You like to dance, don't you?" I asked, my smile no longer so strained. "Lena said you were quite good." The evening of the 25th of September was unseasonably warm, almost reminiscent of summer. Even as autumn was beginning to paint the maple leaves outside in deep crimson hues, I sat alone in my aging house on the outskirts of the city, specifically in the downstairs bathroom, where the dim light from a single bulb cast a dull glow on the tiled walls. The water in the bathtub was luxuriantly hot, with a fragrant lavender scent emanating from the bath salts, and with my eyes closed, I attempted to simply melt into the soothing warmth, hoping to banish all memories and anxieties of the day. My hair, though still thick and full, had begun to show the first signs of silver, gathered together in a messy bun, while my skin, despite the advancing years, retained a certain softness that I secretly took pride in, a fact that I often pondered privately. I wasn't expecting any visitors. Evelina, my beloved daughter, had departed for the weekend with a group of her close friends, leaving me to embrace the quiet solitude. Her husband, Sergei, she explained, was preoccupied with some. My fingers dug into his shoulders, leaving marks, and his arms guided me, strong and sure, until I felt wave after wave of something that made me tremble, calling out his name. When it was over, we remained on the sofa, breathing heavily, still intertwined, as though fearing that reality would return too quickly. His fingers lazily stroked my back, and I snuggled against him, feeling his heart beat beneath my palm. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, a habit I'd adopted since living alone, and I suddenly regretted it. "Who's there?" I called out, attempting to project a firm voice, but a slight tremor betrayed my underlying nervousness. The door creaked open further, and Sergei's imposing figure filled the doorway. His broad shoulders almost brushed against the doorframe, and he was clad in a dark shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, paired with jeans that seemed tailored to his physique, molded perfectly to his figure. In his hands, he held a bottle of beer, but his gaze was sharp and clear, certainly not intoxicated, but rather intensely scrutinizing. Instinctively, I covered my chest with my hands, even though the water and remaining bubbles concealed almost everything, and I felt the blood rush to my cheeks, making them flush a noticeable shade of red. "Sergei?" My voice was softer than I intended, barely above a whisper, betraying more anxiety than I was comfortable revealing, and I asked, "What are you doing here?" "Lena's not home." He didn't reply immediately, only took a step forward, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe with an air of nonchalant arrogance. His eyes scanned over me with deliberate slowness, and I felt a sudden surge of heat wash over my skin, completely independent of the warm water. It was a strange sensation, a bewildering mixture of embarrassment and something else entirely, something I didn't wish to acknowledge, but had difficulty ignoring. "I know she's not here," he said finally, his voice low and touched with a certain raspiness that sent a shiver down my spine. I just wanted to see if you were all right. I don't need you to check on me, I replied, attempting to sound stern, but my voice wavered betrayingly. I'm perfectly fine. Please, just leave, Sergei. He didn't move an inch. Instead, he took a swig from the beer bottle, his eyes never leaving mine. There was something in his gaze that made me freeze. Not fear, but something far more complicated and potentially dangerous. Something I was having trouble recognizing or understanding. I suddenly became acutely aware that I was sitting nearly naked in the bathtub in front of my daughter's husband, and the realization was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. "You're always so stern, Anna Ivanovna," he said, and there was a hint of amusement in his voice, though not cruel, but almost playful. "I simply came to have a conversation." A conversation. I raised an eyebrow, attempting to regain some semblance of control over the situation, and to gain back some authority. "Then wait for me in the living room. I'll be out presently." But he didn't leave. Instead, he set the beer bottle on the shelf near the door and took another step, bringing him very close to the tub, almost uncomfortably close. I felt my breathing become shallow and uneven. His presence was almost palpable. The scent of his cologne, a sharp cedar fragrance, mingled with the lavender scent of the water, and I found myself involuntarily inhaling deeply. "You're not as austere as you try to appear, Anna. I've seen the way you look at me when you think I don't notice." I opened my mouth to object, but the words caught in my throat. He was right, and that was the most frightening thing of all. Sometimes, when he and Lena visited, I would catch myself lingering on his strong hands or broad back, but I always forced those thoughts away, reminding myself that he was my daughter's husband. Now he stood here, inside my bathroom, gazing at me as though he knew all my secrets. "This is wrong," I whispered, but my voice was weak, almost unconvincing. I should have stood up and ordered him to leave, but my body remained immobile, transfixed by his nearness. He smiled slowly, almost predatory, and I felt his fingers brush against the edge of the tub, very close to my own hand. "Wrong?" he repeated, his voice even lower and more velvety. "Who decides what is right and what is wrong?" I was at a loss for words. The water in the tub was growing colder, but I felt flushed, incredibly hot. His gaze moved over my shoulders and neck, and I felt goosebumps rise on my skin where his eyes lingered. It was utter madness, but I couldn't break his gaze. "Sergei," I began, but he interrupted, leaning in closer until I felt the warmth of his breath on my cheek. "Just tell me to leave, Anna. Say the words, and I will go." But I remained silent, and that silence was deafening. A heavy silence hung between us, thick like the air before a thunderstorm. "You're not as austere as you try to appear, Anna. I've seen the way you look at me when you think I don't notice." I opened my mouth to object, but the words caught in my throat. He was right, and that was the most frightening thing of all. Sometimes, when he and Lena visited, I would catch myself lingering on his strong hands or broad back. But I always forced those thoughts away, reminding myself that he was my daughter's husband. Now, he stood here, inside my bathroom, gazing at me, as though he knew all my secrets. "This is wrong," I whispered, but my voice was weak, almost unconvincing. "This should not be happening. You are married to my daughter." He didn't respond immediately, only continued to look at me, and in his eyes, I saw something that made me catch my breath. Something that wasn't anger or amusement, but rather a strange, almost tender curiosity, mixed with a longing that he didn't even attempt to conceal. "Lena," he said finally, and his voice was calm, but with a slight huskiness, as if he was restraining himself. "Lena is far away and we are here. Just you and I." I swallowed, feeling a wave of heat spread throughout my body despite the cooling water. "The police?" he repeated, and in his voice there was a hint of mockery. "What is the charge, Anna? For paying a friendly visit to one's mother-in-law? For a friendly chat?" "This is not a friendly chat," I snapped, but my heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed as though he could hear it. "You barged into my home, into my bathroom. This is not normal." The remaining bubbles that had been covering me began to dissipate, and I instinctively crossed my arms over my chest, attempting to maintain some form of protection. But his gaze appeared to pierce through everything, through the bubbles, through my efforts to seem unapproachable. "You don't understand what you're saying," I said, attempting to sound more forceful. "This is madness, Sergey. Please, just leave before I call the police." He raised an eyebrow, and the corner of his lips quirked into a slight smile. He straightened, but didn't move away. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest, causing his shirt to stretch, emphasizing his strong muscles. "Not normal?" He tilted his head, as though examining me. "What is normal, Anna? Hiding away in this old house, pretending that you're not lonely. I see the way you look at me, and I am not blind." His words struck me like a slap. I wanted to protest, to say that he was mistaken, but the truth was he wasn't. I had noticed him. His broad shoulders, his purposeful movements, the way he occupied any space he entered, with such authority. "And you're out of your mind. Leave, Sergey, or I will." "Or what?" He stepped closer, and now his knee was almost touching the edge of the tub. "You're not screaming. You're not calling for help. Why, Anna?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He was right, and that terrified me more than anything else. I should have been screaming, ordering him to leave, but instead I was frozen, like a rabbit caught in the headlights of a car, feeling his presence envelop me like a suffocating cloud. He crouched down, bringing his face level with mine. His eyes, dark with golden flecks, gazed directly into mine, and I felt my breathing hitch. "I don't bite," he said softly, almost a whisper, and his hand slid slowly, almost lazily, toward the water, touching it with his fingertips. "Unless, of course, you want me to." I gasped at his boldness, but my body responded to his words with traitorous eagerness, to the light touch of his fingers in the water that was so close to my skin. This was madness, a sin, but in that moment, I couldn't think about Lena, about morality, about what was right. His gaze held me captive, and I felt myself sinking into it, into this forbidden and dangerous attraction. "Sergey," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "this is a mistake." He smiled, and that smile was both gentle and predatory. "Mistakes can sometimes be so very tempting," he said, and his fingers, still touching the water, moved slightly closer, almost brushing my shoulder. I froze, unable to move, feeling my body betray me, responding to his nearness with a heat that I hadn't felt in years. Something within me screamed that I needed to stop, but another part, darker and more greedy, wanted to know what would happen next. The bathroom seemed to shrink down to the size of that moment. Just I, Sergei, and the tension that crackled between us like an electrical surge. His fingers, still touching the water, hovered a millimeter from my shoulder, and I felt the heat of his hand even without touching it. My skin burned under his gaze, and I was furious with myself for this weakness, for not simply standing up and ordering him to leave. But there was something hypnotic in his eyes, something that made me forget who he was, who I was, and what separated us. Sergei, I whispered again, but there was no longer the firmness in my voice that I had been trying to project earlier. It was almost a moan, almost a plea, and I hated myself for it. We can't, Lena. His expression flickered, but not with shame or uncertainty. He leaned in even closer until I felt the warmth of his breath on my neck. Lena won't find out, he said softly, and his voice was like velvet, enveloping me, enticing me. This is only between us, Anna. No one will ever know. I gripped the edges of the tub so tightly that my knuckles turned white. His words were like poison, sweet and dangerous. I knew that I should resist, but my body disobeyed. His hand slowly rose from the water, and I flinched when his fingers finally touched my shoulder. A light, almost weightless touch, but it burned like hot metal. I wanted to pull away, but instead I froze, as though spellbound. "You're trembling," he observed, and his voice was filled with something dark, almost triumphant. He didn't move, only looked at me, and in his gaze there was something new, not just lust, but a challenge, as though he was testing how far I would allow him to go. "Are you certain?" he asked, and his hand hovered near my collarbone, neither retreating nor moving forward. "Your body tells a different story, Anna." I felt my cheeks flush with shame and anger. His fingers slid higher to my neck, leaving a trail of goosebumps in their wake. It was so wrong, so sinful. But my body responded to his every movement as though it had been waiting for years for this touch. I closed my eyes, attempting to gather my thoughts, but an image of Lena, her trusting smile, flashed through my mind, and I recoiled sharply. "No," I breathed, opening my eyes. "This is wrong, Sergei. Leave. Now." He was right, and that was the most humiliating thing of all. My muscles were tense, my heart was racing, and I knew that if I remained in that tub for even a moment longer, I would lose control. I grabbed the towel lying on the edge of the tub, and without looking at him, began to stand up. Water streamed down my skin. The bubble subsided, and I could feel his gaze, heavy like a physical touch. I said, "Leave," I repeated, this time more firmly, wrapping the towel around myself. My legs were trembling, but I forced myself to stand straight, looking him in the eye. "This is my home, Sergei, and I will not allow you." He smirked, straightening, but not retreating. "You are already allowing it, Anna. You allowed me to stay when I walked in. You allowed me to come closer. You allowed me." He paused, his gaze sliding over my body wrapped in the towel. "To touch you." I gritted my teeth, feeling anger battling with something darker and more dangerous. He was too close. His scent, a mixture of cologne and something musky, masculine, filled the space, and I felt my resolve falter. "It was a mistake," I said, backing toward the wall to increase the distance between us. and it won't happen again. Leave, or I will scream." He raised an eyebrow, but there was no fear in his eyes, only a slight disappointment, mixed with something that resembled respect. "Very well," he said finally, raising his hands as if surrendering. "I will leave, but you know where to find me if you change your mind." He turned slowly, as though giving me time to stop him. But I remained silent. My lips were pressed together, and my fingers were clenched around the towel, so tightly that my nails dug into the fabric. Sergei took a step toward the door, but paused, casting one last glance at me over his shoulder. His eyes were dark and deep, as though promising that this wasn't the end, that this moment, this evening, would remain between us like a secret we would both carry. Then he left, and I heard his footsteps fade away in the hallway. Then the front door closed. The silence that followed was deafening, but it couldn't drown out the storm raging within me. I stood with my back pressed against the cold, tiled wall, still clutching the towel, my skin burning where his fingers had touched it, and I hated myself for it. How could I have allowed it to go so far? How could I have succumbed to that temptation even for a second? Lena, my sweet daughter, her face flashed before my eyes, and guilt washed over me like a wave, threatening to drag me under. But along with the guilt, there was something else, something dark and burning that I didn't want to acknowledge. Desire. It throbbed in my veins, and I couldn't ignore it, no matter how hard I tried. I slowly sank to the floor, feeling the cold tiles penetrate through the towel. The water in the tub had grown completely cold. The bubbles had dissipated, leaving only a faint lavender scent that now seemed foreign. I attempted to collect my thoughts, but they were jumbled, returning to Sergei, to his voice, his hands, his gaze that seemed to see right through me. He was right. I had allowed him to stay. I had allowed him to come closer. And, damn it, I had wanted him to touch me again. I shook my head, banishing those thoughts. This was madness. He was my daughter's husband, and I was a woman who had lived alone for too long, forgetting what it meant to feel desired. I should have been stronger. I forced myself to stand, wrapping the towel tighter around myself, as though it could protect me from my own thoughts. Emerging from the bathroom, I walked into the living room, where a faint trace of his cologne still lingered. It made my heart skip a beat. I turned on the lights, attempting to restore the room to its familiar coziness, but everything felt foreign. On the table, there was the bottle of beer that he had left, and I stared at it as though it were a piece of incriminating evidence. Approaching, I picked it up, the cold glass burning my fingers. I wanted to throw it away, to erase any reminder of what had transpired. But instead, I simply placed it back down, as though afraid to destroy something that I didn't understand myself. The telephone was lying on the sofa, and I grabbed it, checking to see if there were any messages from Lena. She had written in the morning that everything was fine, that she was with her friends, and that she would return in a few days. Her carefree tone broke my heart. How could I look her in the eye after this? But even worse was the thought that I might not have stopped him, that if I hadn't said no, if I had allowed him, I banished these thoughts, but they returned like waves crashing against the shore. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Lying in the darkness, I listened to every creak and groan, as though expecting Sergei to return. A part of me dreaded it, but another, darker part almost hoped for it. I went to the door but didn't open it. Looking through the peephole, I saw him. Sergei stood on the porch in the same dark shirt, with a slight smile that was both daring and alluring. "Anna," he called through the door, and his voice was soft, but it held the same power as the evening before. "Open up. We need to talk." I tossed and turned until the first birds began to sing outside, heralding the morning. The following day, I attempted to occupy myself with activities, cleaning, cooking, anything that could distract me. But the thoughts of Sergei wouldn't leave me. I caught myself staring at the front door, as though he might appear again. And when there was a knock in the evening, my heart leaped into my throat and my hands began to tremble. I froze, pressing my hand against my chest where my heart pounded like a trapped bird. To open the door meant to step onto that dangerous precipice once more, but to keep it closed meant to pretend that yesterday evening hadn't happened, and I wasn't sure which I wanted more. I stood by the door, feeling my heart beating so loudly that it seemed he could hear it through the wooden barrier. His voice, soft but insistent, still echoed in my ears. "Anna, open up. We need to talk." I knew that I shouldn't open the door. I knew that every step in that direction was a betrayal of Lena, of myself, of everything I believed in. But my fingers were already resting on the doorknob, trembling as though they didn't obey me. Two desires warred within, one to slam the door on this temptation forever, the other to succumb, if only for a moment, to something that had long been dormant within me. "Sergei," I said, attempting to make my voice sound firm, but it trembled, betraying my inner turmoil. "Leave. We have nothing to talk about." He didn't reply immediately, and I pictured him standing there on the porch, wearing that same daring smile as the evening before. "Are you certain?" he finally asked, and his voice was lower, almost intimate, as though he was speaking not through the door, but directly into my ear. "I saw your eyes yesterday, Anna. You can lie to yourself, but not to me." I gritted my teeth, feeling the blood rush to my cheeks. He was right, and that angered me more than anything else. Yesterday I had almost succumbed, almost allowed that madness to engulf me. But today was a new day, and I couldn't allow myself to be that weak again. I thought of Lena, of her laughter, of her trusting eyes, of the way she hugged me when she visited. I can't do it. I couldn't betray her. "Leave," I repeated, this time louder, with a force that I didn't expect from myself. "If you ever come here again, I will call Lena and the police." The silence behind the door became almost tangible. I waited, holding my breath, not knowing what he would do, whether he would leave or begin to knock again, demanding that I open the door. But after a few seconds, I heard his footsteps, slow and heavy, retreating across the gravel driveway. I pressed my forehead against the door, feeling the tension slowly leave my body, but leaving behind a hollow emptiness. When I was certain that he was gone, I moved away from the door and collapsed onto the sofa, covering my face with my hands. shame, relief, and something else that I didn't want to name, mixed within me like a storm. I knew that I had done the right thing, but that didn't change what I had felt yesterday. That heat, that forbidden longing that he had awakened within me. This should not be happening. You are married to my daughter. He didn't respond immediately, only continued to look at me. And in his eyes, I saw something that made me catch my breath. Something that wasn't anger or amusement, but rather a strange, almost tender curiosity, mixed with a longing that he didn't even attempt to conceal. "Lena," he said finally. And his voice was calm, but with a slight huskiness. "Just you and I," but I remained silent. I couldn't tell her. I couldn't destroy her world. Instead, I persuaded her to go away for a while, to take a vacation, to rest, to think about herself. She agreed, and I helped her pack her belongings, feeling that this was my way of atoning for my guilt. When Lena left, I remained alone in the house, but now the loneliness didn't feel as heavy. I began to put my life in order, but sometimes, at night, I would awaken with memories of his touch, of his gaze, of his fingers almost brushing my skin, and I would have to remind myself that I had made a choice. A month later, Lena told me that she and Sergey had been arguing more and more often. She looked tired, and her eyes had lost their former sparkle. I listened, holding her hand, and felt my heart tearing between the desire to protect her and the fear that the truth about that evening might surface. I sorted through old letters, threw away that very bottle of beer that he had left behind, and even repainted the walls of the bathroom, as though attempting to erase that evening from my memory. But I knew that it would remain with me forever, not as a regret, but as a reminder of how close I had come to the edge. Sergey never came again. Lena, returning a few months later, told me that she had filed for divorce. I had learned to live with them, not allowing them to control me. And in that, perhaps, was my small victory.